From my perspective, I look at AI, all the other cool things we work on, as just tools to solve problems.
Is there a standardization that you think would enforce the kind of behavior you would ideally want?
I feel that question is something that changes with time.
As a person who is able to see the consequence of the whole team's productivity, what are you seeing there? And is there like a best way to use things?
Personally, I found using GPT to an extent definitely improves productivity to a massive extent.
Have you been leaning towards the chat GPTs or more the open source ones and then you have them locally?
I did use Llama initially, but in order to build a chatbot, I decided to use OpenAI. It's not that expensive.
What do you think the local maximum for the acceleration of this technology might be?
So all these people have mobile phones. Think about using those as compute systems.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. We had to.
This is Ashish Sial. He is currently the director of AI and ML at a company called Lantronix in British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. He was at Sierra Wireless for 13 years and in various positions, chief engineer, principal engineer, senior staff engineer, and he was at VTech for a few years as a team lead. So he's been in the industry for quite some time. He's quite experienced, and we're going to talk to him primarily about AI in the various areas in the organization and how it's sort of applying itself. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
So I first of all, I'd like to know what your day to day is like at work. Like, what is it like to be the director of AI, especially as things are changing? How does it differ from what it was to what it is now?
So, a lot of the work I do today is about understanding both the business as well as the technology side of AI. So, part of my job is understanding how we can bring various functions of AI into the organization, improving the efficiency of the organization, number one, but also how we can apply AI to our products. So we're looking both at it, AI as in improving operational efficiency, as well as improving our products that we take to the market.
Right.
Ultimately, our goal is to improve and bring to market solutions that help solve customer problems. And for doing that, the efficient you are as an organization by applying AI, and the products you bring to the market that apply AI help our customers as well. So it's efficiency, improvement of efficiency across the organization, and in our products that help customers as well.
So it's basically permeating throughout the organization, for all the way from like you said, inside and outside, in terms of how the products are actually going to get distributed or how they actually work, all the way to how you guys actually do things. So how has that process been like, and where is sort of the efficiencies that you feel AI is has been better at now that you're trying it and testing it out?
I joined this company around. I joined Lantronix. By the way, it's a U.S. company. It's based in Irvine, and
Oh, right.
we do a variety
Sorry.
of products. That's fine. We do a variety of products across the board. We do gateways, cellular gateways. We do routers, switches. We have our own MVNO. We are an MVNO, so for cellular connectivity, and we also build compute modules that do AI functionality.
Right.
So that's an overall description of Lantronix today. When I joined Lantronix at that time, GPT had just was not there yet. GPT-3 was around, and come December or so, when GPT-3 came out and people started using 3.5 a lot more, um,
Mm-hmm.
there was something where we said, okay, can we apply that internally to our organization? And we started building, as is very common right now, conversational bots that we can use to apply to our I would say all the documentation that are within the company,
Mm-hmm.
and the PDFs, the websites, and said, okay, let's use all of that to answer customer questions, right? So rather than a customer waiting X amount of time, can we drop that response time by multiple fold? So that was one way we found we can improve the performance or efficiency within the organization in responding to customers. Number two, we are also using it to educate people within the organization. If they have a question, they can go to the bot and ask questions like, what does this product do? How many, um, I would say, how many SIM cards does it have inside the product? How many Ethernet ports does it have? So rather than searching through documents, and even that 20 minutes that you might spend looking through the documentation, now you're saying, I'll just go to the bot and ask them a question. So that kind of efficiency improvement is what we're beginning to see within the organization itself in terms of response times internally to our own engineers asking questions, externally to customers. And thirdly, I would also say what was surprising to us was as we built the system is the ability to code based on our own standards. So, for example, Lantronix has a standard called PFAL, which is something that we had built, and the adoption rate itself is something we want to see. We want to increase it over time. And in order to do that, you need a lot of GitHub source code, which we didn't in some ways. So, can we start writing the code through the chatbot we built? And we started seeing that the performance of the system is extremely good in terms of the code output it is giving. So if a customer wants to build with our products, they can just go type it in. And our goal is to allow them to start using this interface to start building as well.
Wow, that's extremely powerful. So it's already, and people talk a lot about AI's ability to write code, but you're it's able to output code that you feel is pretty good.
We feel it's pretty good. It helps, in my view. There's a chasm between reading a document and applying the code because as a developer, and I do a lot of coding, I feel the first code you build is the toughest journey in terms of the final output. But if someone has a template, you can always use it better and faster. So that is something we're seeing. The first template that's coming out from these bots is extremely, I would say, very accurate in some ways for small pieces of code. And if it is not also very accurate, it's close enough for you to then start making changes to the code structure itself.
And the code that's generated is based on it's not like sort of it's a question coming from, or sorry, it's an answer coming from ChatGPT to somebody who it is colored by the internal documentation. So
Yeah.
it is specific to your organization.
Yeah. So the way
Right.
the bots work is, I'll explain the flow itself for the LLMs,
Right.
right? So the first thing we do is we'll take complete data sets and we might take it from the website, we might scan through the websites, we might take PDF documents. And once we have the documentation, we create what's known as an embedded vector database. So I'm using
Right.
Pinecone right now. So I take the database, I create an embedded vector database. And then I'm using what's known as LangChain. LangChain is an orchestration framework. And using that, I'm writing some Python code. And with that, what happens is when someone asks a query, that query is converted into prompts. So someone asks a question, convert it to a prompt, and allows me to search through the vector database. Then I'm using OpenAI. So I take the prompt, I take some of the most relevant pieces of the embedded vector database that I've created, send it to OpenAI, and it responds back with the most appropriate answer for us. Right. So as an example, if I enter as a question, would you write for me a piece of Lua code? Lua is a language which is using the PFAL standards from Lantronix and generate a piece of code for me. What the system then does in the background is it searches through the Pinecone database that includes the documentation, picks out the relevant pieces, combines it with the prompt, sends it to OpenAI, and using the OpenAI foundation models, it generates a piece of code in Lua. And that piece
Okay.
of code in Lua is using the PFAL standard that Lantronix has. You can see there's a complete flow here from end to end. Ask a question, use the embedded vector. You have created an embedded vector database. That's the part we
Right.
do. And that question converts into a prompt. The two pieces of data combine, it goes to OpenAI. OpenAI then helps create a complete piece of code, and the user sees it on their front end.
So one question I'd love to ask is a little bit about security. So there's Pinecone, there's Redis, there's Chroma for embedded vector databases.
Yes.
Why
Mm-hmm.
Pinecone as opposed to any other sort of solution? Well, is it convenience or familiarity?
It's a very good question, right? So I
Yeah.
was looking at Chroma as well. I looked at Chroma. There's FAIS, FAISS as well. I looked at that as
Yeah.
I found that Pinecone, when I started building, that's the first one I came across. There was Chroma as well, but
Yeah,
I
Chroma.
just found it so easy to work with. For me, maybe others have a different opinion. For me, it just flowed. I took, I paid them for a monthly subscription,
Yeah.
was able to create my database, then use that. So I have no problems with it. I mean, of course, I've looked at Chroma as well. I've looked at Files. I just found this to be more easy to use from my own perspective. It was ease of use, I would say. And I
Right.
know that it's going to work because in some ways, when you pay for something, maybe it's just a mental model, but you have a bit of a guarantee.
Yeah.
Although initially, I would say there were times where their Northeast server would come down quite a bit. I don't know why. Maybe they're running on GCP or something where the system would come down. And then I went to the Twitter as well, complaining to them, and they would respond back like, "Oh, it's not working." I'm like, "Why is it not working?" So it was like that was a couple of months ago, but I think they've improved since.
Yeah. I'm just using Redis because um,
Yes.
it can scale in multiple platforms, and the embedding it just for these. I'm not sure what Pinecone is doing specifically, but it's just storing and embedding, and the embedding is generated by the
Yes.
OpenAI abstraction.
Yes.
So
That's
it's
what
like
it
if you're just
is.
storing and embedding, then just store it where you want to store it, and then if it's just like if you're just really trying to optimize for O1 access, then
Hmm.
Redis can do it. You know?
I use I use Redis. I use Redis initially for caching because giving me faster
Yeah.
responses for caching, but not for a complete storage perspective. Redis was more a caching system for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's great that you gave us that sort of sort of like story and a narrative and sort of the structure and architecture. Because now that people understand, based on what you're saying, hey, this is how it's sort of structured normally, then it's very interesting in thinking about how that's going to actually apply to the IoT space. Because a bunch of the examples you gave us for
Hmm.
code was actually code for IoT devices, because you're talking about sort of
Hmm. Hmm.
routers and things like that. So when you dump this sort of problem into that space where connectivity, I mean, the router is kind of obvious that the connectivity is there, but there's security issues. There's a bunch of complexities there. And then maybe IoT devices that aren't really meant to be connected to the internet. How exactly are they using AI and being able to leverage this technology? Are they also talking to these devices? And sorry, are they also talking to OpenAI? And what are the concerns there? I think that's something no one else has
No.
really even tried to talk about, right? Everyone, I think people are just enamored with the technology right now.
So yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, that's a very good way to express it. Enamorment with technology. From my perspective, I look at AI, um, all the other cool things we work on as just tools to solve problems. Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to solve customer problems, and how can we do it faster in a more efficient way so they can go ahead and deploy their systems. So from that perspective, because of my experience in IoT as well, I look at everything in AI is just how can I use it in the IoT domain. So this is one way in which you can use it. There are many other ways as well, which I think will become prominent, but it is more about applied AI. It is not about building neural networks. It's more about how do you use these models, these large language models, or even in some ways the narrow models as well. How do you use both of them within the IoT system? And would you, and this goes back to the security thing, would you go and push this data that you have to an open AI system which has access to your data, to the IoT data itself, which your
Right,
customers may not like? Or do you want to use the more open source models like Falcon or Llama within your device and
right.
allow it to continuously train itself over time and build much better prompts to be able to interact directly with the data? I mean, I'm sure you might have heard about the Voyager project, which is working with Minecraft, and they're trying to build this whole extremely sophisticated Minecraft, I said, playing system.
Ecosystem. Yeah,
Ecosystem, right? So they're playing for 12 hours. And I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they talked about it, where they said, look, we have this Voyager system working just using OpenAI and with just prompts and just learning so many things about the Minecraft itself, right? So
right.
I feel that's what's going to happen in the IoT domain as well. You might have these open source models working within the device, interacting with the data, and in some ways over time getting better at interacting with it.
They with the idea of having these models dump sort of sitting on IoT devices, there are like size constraints and performance constraints, and is that going to rotate how IoT devices are made and optimized, or do we have things that are already able to cope with that, right? IoT, as it is with most things with software, you just sort of shift the balance of what you need relative to basically the
Yes.
reality of your hardware. And really it's really about speed and process. It's really about speed of just processing in space, right? And you sort of rotate it based on what that situation needs the most. And so for IoT, what is that balance? And
Hmm. Hmm.
is that balance going to change? Do you like, an easy thing to say is just NVIDIA chips on everything or something, right? But from someone who really knows, what do you think that is?
That's a very good question as well. I think you have to look at IoT as a huge spectrum, right? You have the smallest constrained devices where you could just run a TensorFlow light model to do, and that's a narrow model you're running, doing specific work there. But at bigger devices, not the NVIDIA A100s, but I would say more a computer vision kind of chipsets, you would say, okay, like the cost of a computer vision is so much as sending data. Can I use something on the device itself to reduce that cost? So I think the use of these models will become, in some ways, the foundation models will be more restricted.
Right,
But over time, you might find that even some of these narrow models might become more text-based and do much more narrow work. But that's relevant to the device on which they're used. But it's
right.
I see that over time. Right now, I think, as you said, there's a lot of noise and excitement about the big models on big devices. But I think over time, because of cost and latency issues, you might be doing uh, not not foundation models, but smaller models on the edge devices.
How do you feel the cost is uh, on IoT? Is that going to blow up the cost of IoT devices on average, or is just sort of is it cheap to dump into them and then sort of sell that as as an increase in value add?
So if you look at, say, computer vision systems, right, there's a huge amount of data. If you take a camera, right, and if you want fast response to something, you say at a retail shop, you see something happening, um, and if suppose it's a lone worker safety problem, and you're saying, I want to protect this worker, what do you do? So you need continuous
Right,
transmission of data back to the cloud. So it's a huge amount of data going to the cloud, and the cloud
right,
companies charge you for the amount of data coming in and then the processing you do. And sometimes if you go offline, there's no way to respond as well. But for those kind of systems, if you build foundation models into the device, you might be able to do things that will protect you or prevent the data from having to be going all the time to the cloud, and you're paying that extra cost, and latency can also be faster. So I feel there's
right.
a balance there. In some ways, you would like the data to go all the time, but it's extremely expensive. But there's an added cost of adding foundation models, so more memory, higher CPU needed. So you have to balance it out to say where is the balance. And those business decisions, I think, will definitely be something that will be asked over time and very soon, I would say.
Another complexity, and I think a good example of this is sort of driving and
Hmm.
sort of the complexity. And it's funny enough, a little bit of that is IoT, but we were promised self-driving for many years, and I think the effort was genuinely made, but also think that the reality is it's that 1% that makes the difference. Where, and I think there was a movie a few years ago that Will Smith was in, and the robot saved the
Hmm.
probabilistically most likely person to survive, as opposed to sort of what a human would value, which is the person who has the most life left to live. And that sort of those that kind of decision making, and I think that just sort of exemplifies an extreme. But just just to bring it down a little bit more is even the some of the little things where you talk about what is the perception of error, what is an error in that case, right? Like, I mean, is that an error? Technically, no. And
Hmm.
so, how does that affect the way we sort of we have models deployed in real life where they make autonomous decisions in a way, especially on obviously what human life is an extreme, but there are other situation categorizations of individuals based
Hmm.
on one thing or another. The sort of there's a
Hmm.
square of error that most people understand, and sort of where those where people so where software hits on that square can determine a lot of things. So how do we? Is there a way you're thinking about that,
Yes, yes, yes.
especially with IoT devices, where you can't say this is the it's Google's fault, right? Where it's a little easy to see what the blame is for him. This one is to point at a camera and say it's the camera's fault. It's an interesting thing.
Yes, yes. I think so. It's very interesting in that sense. So, a couple of weeks ago, I was working on training a system for, say, LaneNet. LaneNet is for detecting the lanes on the road, and
Mm,
I was using a model called Too Simple using PyTorch. So it's PyTorch running with a Too Simple data set.
right.
And I found that when my data was really small, my model was behaving. It thought everything it was doing was right. As I increased my data, the model was saying it was getting more accurate. But the model itself was not wrong. The model was the same model. It's how I trained it with different amounts of data was determining the performance of the model. So the AI technology itself is okay, but how I trained it, the biases I create in it through my data, ultimately determine what decisions it makes. So back to your Will Smith example, it's the data that you train with, and what biases you build into the data will determine the actions of the AI model itself. And that's something which I think most of the AI people working in the AI field are aware of, right? You have to make sure
Right.
the data is diverse enough, wide enough, and is done broad enough, right? So foundation models are very broad, narrow models are much narrower, and the data sets are
Right.
wide.
Right.
And the application of the models at the end will be determined also by the amount of data you give and the biases that are built into the model itself.
Is there a minimum? You know, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so how you enforce in a positive direction to ensure one thing or another. So um, you could have legislation to say, here is a minimum data set that every
Mm-hmm,
model
mm-hmm,
must be trained on to create a certain level of balance
mm-hmm,
for one thing or another, right? So
mm-hmm,
and then you sort of tweak that data set towards the direction that you feel that you want, but it must have this baseline. So that's easier to said than done, and somebody has to but do you have and this is sort of a spitball version of it, right? But is there a standardization that you think would enforce and relative to the context the kind of behavior you would ideally want, a kind of symmetry in outcomes?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I feel that question is something that changes with time. If 10 years when 10 years ago there was the GPUs that Nvidia were not there, and AlexNet, which came out in 2013, proved the performance was improving so much when they were trained on much bigger data sets, right? So that's what AlexNet proved. Look, my classification improved from 25% to 15% because I trained on a much wider data set, and um, Alex had actually trained with two GPUs working together. That was very difficult at that time, and certainly the
Right.
performance improved. So what is happening right now is with convolution networks, neural networks, plus the high amount of data that's available and the GPU that's available, the models are getting better. And what is
Right.
not to say that as more GPUs available, the training itself becomes better. So I think the training is only going to improve, and the performance of models will improve because we now have a much bigger data sets and it's cheaper to train in some ways. So 5 years ago, the performance of the models was limited by what they had, and today it is better because we're able to train more. Although GPUs are still something you don't get access to easily, but
No.
that's something that is just over time gets better. So where you are today will improve much faster in the next couple of years.
Let's zoom out a little bit and talk about, and thank you so much for all you've talked about in sort of the speculative space and seeing
Mhm,
how
mhm,
things are going to evolve. But the reality is, you are having an experience right now with how you are able to be productive, and you sort of leaned on it a little bit earlier with
mhm.
how people use uh, the product and how they can generate code, and that's sort of customer facing. But then internally, how you guys are actually building code and how engineers are being productive, as a person who is able to see the consequence of the whole team's productivity, what are you
Mhm.
seeing there, and is there like a best way to use things? So those are
Yes.
sort of the two questions.
I'll talk from my personal experience that I've seen working. Personally, I found using GPT to an extent has definitely improves productivity to a massive extent. Like it's taking your operational efficiency much better. And when you look at it from an organizational perspective, it's going to improve efficiency across the organization as it becomes more adopted. It takes time for everyone to adopt it, I would say, but once they start adopting it as an integrated process within the organization, code development becomes much faster. And once that happens, you're able to achieve your targets in a much faster way, and delivery of products will improve in a sense. But I think it will take a time for organizations, and depending on the size of the organizations, bigger organizations will take it a longer time, and smaller will be a bit faster to
Right.
adopt this into the daily ML ops, if you want to call it that.
Right. If someone is someone at your tier is listening to this,
Hmm.
and if you were to give them advice on how to make it possible for their team to sort of bring this in the best way possible and reduce the
Hmm.
amount of this, there might be pushback, there might be churn. So how would you suggest if you want to get this to cascade through the organization, and you know and do it
Hmm.
successfully with the least amount of pushback because people have their way of doing things, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
to affect a person's workflow is a it's a big thing. So
Yes.
how do you make that happen? It's quite a personal journey to interject yourself into.
I mean, throughout my career, I found it sometimes becomes like a religious war. Even asking
It
people to
is.
change from SVN to GitHub to GitLab, it's like it takes a lot to do that.
It
And
takes a
so
lot.
that's why you have to give it space, and you have to know that these things take time to bring into organization. Personally, I found that the best way to do that is discuss with your team, encourage them, let hear the possibilities we have, but also do it yourself. I feel like the best way to make people follow is to do it yourself and go through the process flow once, and then as well as talk to your senior people in your team to say, let's start looking at this and tell me what you think, and then incorporate their decisions into how you want to push it through the organization. I feel it's more, it has to be a journey. It can't be pushed in onto people, but you also, if you can, also go through the journey yourself and have some context as to what it means for others to change. So that's the way I look at it. It's more a broad-based thing. If you try to force it down, there will be opposition because people are used to what they're doing.
Fair, fair enough. So, have you seen some? Have you been impressed by how certain people have been able to really take advantage of it? Is there an example you thought that was really interesting?
Mm, that's a bit difficult because right now we are adopting it within the organization. So it's a bit of a slow process to for us to see as we. It's one thing to build a chatbot. It's one thing to push this through the organization, right? So it's something
Right,
we're
right, right,
working through right now. In a few months, I'll give a broader example to you. But right now, I don't know if everyone's adopting it or not across, not just at my company, but across the board. I've asked to talk to a lot of
yeah,
software engineers. I don't see that adoption being that accelerated. Personally, I feel this is so good, but then when I talk to people, I think there's hesitation because a lot of good software programmers, they're already feeling they're at the max efficiency in some ways, right? Look, I'm
right,
as good
right,
as I
right,
can be, so why do I want to change? But I think
right,
the people who want to, I feel the younger, or not younger, but the junior people who are coming in, they will
right,
adopt it much faster as well because it helps narrow the gap in some ways between the highest performing people and the ones who want to get there.
right. I see in my in my experience, it's been like it's the code that it can give you is so simple,
Hmm.
that it's almost like the the it becomes basically a kind of autocomplete at this
Hmm.
point, and like where there's a certain level of code, and maybe that's just might be my experience so far, but that there's a tier of code that's like you're gonna have to write it yourself, and it can't do that for
Yes.
you yet.
Yes.
But it can do quite a very impressive autocompletes. And one thing is, like, for example, Python doesn't have auto imports the way JavaScript has on VS Code,
Hmm.
so it's able to sort of help you with that a little bit and all that kind of stuff. So languages that are um, a bit more esoteric now that Python is, but
Hmm.
I think it can infer things that you would have to get certain things. You would have to get auto imports and all these sort of tools. So it kind of is an all in one dev extension in a way for your productivity. But there are like having it sort of write something for you that's truly complex, and I think for people who are really good, their code is actually quite small and is terse,
Yes.
and it's
I,
but it does a lot at the same time. So then it's like that it can't do that just yet.
it can't do
But I
that
have
for
been
sure.
impressed. Yeah, it can't do that just yet. But I have been impressed with like it can just infer like basically. based on it can infer by basically like a really simple function. It was simple to write, but now I don't have to write it. And
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
if it can do that over and over again, that would be nice.
I
But then
think
you don't write that that much.
if you
Sorry,
break your
go
code
ahead.
into more modular systems and modular structures, and you are
Yeah,
able to work on the system architecture and say, these are small pieces I need, can you quickly generate it? And then
yeah,
integrate back into the bigger code. I don't think it can go and write a complete end-to-end system for you, but smaller pieces of code you can
no,
integrate back into your system. Which again, that's what I was saying. It might be more useful for the junior person who's joining, because for them it
right,
gets them accelerated much faster, because they get to see the whole picture way faster than a more senior people who can just code it away. So I think it
right.
depends on where you are in your journey as well as to how you adopt it.
What about unit testing? So what's your because the unit I know it's very useful, but I don't like
Hmm.
writing it.
Yes,
So
unit testing for sure, for sure. We feel like it's something we are going to build it into our system, into our culture,
right,
to use this to start building small amounts of unit test back into the
right,
system. I remember a couple of months ago, someone had a GitHub paper where they talked about a complete end-to-end system where they were generating unit tests for the code that was written. And
right,
so code was put in, and the GPT, Auto GPT, so it was very popular a couple of months ago. They're using Auto GPT to create unit tests for the system and then pass it through the whole test infrastructure to use that. I don't know where that the
right.
status is today, but I think that was something I was following very closely, and then got
Yeah,
busy with other things as well.
fair enough. So a big thing I think is being able to communicate. This is something you've been doing for a long time. Communicate these reasonably esoteric and abstract ideas to people who have other uh, of other skill sets and other
Hmm.
expertises and other with other concerns and things, and justifying the value to some degree. This one, the value is a bit easier to justify because I think it's the interface is the human expression, but then
Hmm.
being able to integrate it and justify a style of integration, that's a bit more of a nuanced conversation. But how's that experience been with sales, marketing, finance, other HR, trying to see and trying to have a conversation about the value of this sort of technology and the value of its. I mean, people who do copy understand that it has a value, and the integration is zero for them. But for you, it's a lot more intense. That integration is a lot more intricate. So, how's that conversation been? Was there pushback, and how was that? Um, how were you
I
able to
think
massage that? Because that is its own skill.
so. The way I approached it was I talked to the executive team first, and the feedback was really good. And once you get that buy-in, you say, okay, this makes sense. Otherwise, once you bring in something like that, you have to say, does it is it something that am I just, as you said, is esoteric and as it's people will understand it, but the feedback was extremely good. And then you start, they help you push through the different parts of the organization. And I think that was what helped in some ways to push that idea. It's more a top down in some ways in this case, because once you're able to convince the executive team, it's easier to push it down. People adopt it much faster because it is genuinely useful, but people, when they use it, they want to make sure that is it the right thing to do. Right,
Right.
so I found that
Right.
approach to make sense. The top-down approach in this case made sense. In a lot of other projects I worked on, I found the bottom-up makes sense, but in this particular case, was top-down.
The LLMs you're sort of leaning towards. Have you been leaning towards the chat GPTs or more the open source ones and then you have them locally?
I did use Llama initially on a local
Okay.
system, right? And I was using Llama for a bit, but in order to build the chatbot, I decided to use OpenAI. It was
Yeah. It's a
it
lot
was it's not that
more
expensive with
powerful.
GPT
Yeah,
3.5
it's cheap.
turbo. It's fast enough, it's cheap enough, it does the job.
Is Llama not there yet? Or you have to tweak so much to get that to work locally that it's not worth the time.
It wasn't worth at that time, wasn't worth my time, but I have a lot of hope that over time, when people want to have documents they don't want others to get exposure to, they'll start using more
Yeah.
localized models, right? So I think right now, because the models, the database I'm using is all publicly available, so I don't have a problem just going to GPT itself. So
Fair
yeah.
enough. Yeah, I think those open source models are going to be essential for the growth of this because obviously feeding ChatGPT all your information over time is it's already clear that we've I think given these large organizations so much value and that
Hmm.
GPT is a personification of that value, no pun intended in a way.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, you know, it's interesting to see how people are going to treat their information moving forward because everyone thought it was, GitHub is another thing that was also is also interesting is GitHub. All the open source projects were actually very good projects, very good engineering. Honestly,
Hmm.
there's very few internal projects that are as good as open source projects. As
Hmm.
wonky as you might feel they are, and they are wonky, the code quality is quite high. So
Yes,
for
yes.
ChatGPT to be able to read that and be able to produce value from that, it has an advantage that most junior engineers don't, which is to be able to play with very high quality code.
I mean, before I joined Lantronix, I was leading an open source project. There was for 7 years. I led the foundation and I was a founder and an architect for a platform called Mango. Everything was open source, the hardware, the software, and we were building
Right,
everything on top. I found that concept to make a lot of sense. And I feel that open source models apply a lot in the case of large language models makes a lot more sense than open source IoT in some ways because IoT is more commercial in some ways, but these models will become the foundation to go apply them into technology into these IoT projects. So
right,
I feel like I would definitely hope that with Falcon and Llama, Falcon definitely is in some ways ahead of Llama in performance right now, but I'm sure Llama will come up. And I was also hearing that Facebook is thinking of going completely open source with Llama as well, because today Llama is they released it's not commercial, right? It's more they release the weights and stuff, but you can't use it for a commercial project. Somewhere I was reading a couple of days ago because things so fast are changing so fast that they are thinking of making open source. It'd be good if they do,
right.
and that's going to encourage more innovation and more people to come on board and start building with it. The last thing you want to see is that three or four organizations that control the whole
Have a
infrastructure.
monopoly over this thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm completely, in my view, that's not the right way to go for it.
What do you think the local maximum for the acceleration of this technology might be? Right, like it's accelerating. The acceleration isn't a symptom of human genius per se. It's just a symptom of the potential not having been reached with the sort of the hardware, software, and economic ecosystem. So, is
Hmm.
there? And this is the hard question. I actually have no idea what could be the answer to this. But what do you think the maximum? What do you think the local maximum for this is?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. If you if, like, I grew up in India, and I go there every year or two. And what is very interesting for me is over the last 7 years or so, I go to a shop. Everyone's using the mobile phone to tap for their data, right? For the payment. Everyone's using that for the payment. It's everywhere, and it's even more advanced than what I find here. And I was thinking about it recently. I'm like, so all these people have mobile phones. Think about using those as compute systems. In my view, the AI's biggest potential will be narrowing the gap between people who may not have had the chance to be getting all the formalized education to people who have gone through it, because these language models allow people access to information across the board. It's even more powerful than the internet itself because it's a faster way to learn and bring, right? So if you think about it, if there's a lot of smart kids across Asia, across huge sources of humanity, Africa, Asia, and other places, who have access to hardware, they can run these models and they can build things that humanity did not have a chance to do before. So I think the local maxima is limited by the number of people on Earth now, rather than um, anything else. So I think that's what I think is a more broader change. As long as you don't regulate it down to 4 or 5 companies, the open source aspect of it will allow this to flourish a lot more.
So you believe that this is it's going to get to the individual, and that's what's going to spur. That is the local maximum that's going to spur the next wave of innovation. But it has to
Yes.
get that level first.
It has to get to that level. I feel large organizations will only take it so much, but it has to be
Right,
individuals, a community that eventually adopts it and starts building more. If you look at even, say, the story of mobile, the hardware was done, but the real growth happened because of app developers on top of it. And I feel in this
right.
case as well, it will be the applications, not the core AI, that will determine the
Right.
growth. So the growth is done by people and people who build using the AI models, and that's where I think that will be the local maxima in my view.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate answering all the questions and you really giving us some perspective. I think that you're the first person who's talked about IoT and talked about AI at the same time. And I don't think anyone else was really having to actually deal with the reality of that. And I think that is essentially where things are really going to go. Because at the end of the day, this technology, you're able to speak to it. And like you just said, if you can actually have something in your hand that you're actually speaking to, the interface is human expression. I think that's really, really powerful. So thank you for
Thank
sharing
you for
that
ha-
with us.
Thank you
Where
for
can
having me.
people find you, by the way?
So I'm on Twitter as well under Ashish underscore Sayal underscore, as well as on LinkedIn,
Okay.
Ashish Sayal. You can find me there. I post once in a while, not that often, but I'll definitely be more involved. It seems like a lot more people go on social media right now, so I'll definitely post more there as well.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Well, thank you so much. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.